Chapter 7. The Two Great Cosmic Laws. Someone asked why it was so difficult for us to change anything in ourselves, why we failed so often to step aside from negative emotions, and why it was so hard to self-remember. Because, replied Ouspensky, it is against nature to do all these things. They are quite unnatural. To make such efforts means going against the whole main current of events in our world. Moreover, you have got to remember that we live in a very unfavorable quarter of the universe. Things which can be done quite easily in some parts of the universe are very difficult to do here. The time has now come for us to study these things. So far we have been investigating man, but man cannot be properly understood unless we study at the same time the world in which man lives, for man is a small model of the universe, a microcosm in the macrocosm. He is made out of the same materials and governed by the same laws. When we study the fundamental laws which regulate everything, it is sometimes easier to find examples of their working in ourselves and sometimes in the universe. The study of man and the universe should therefore proceed simultaneously, and already questions have been asked which could not be answered properly without knowing more about the world in which we live. We must turn now, therefore, to the universe and give it our attention. We shall begin, he continued, by examining two great cosmic laws known as the law of three and the law of seven. The first of these laws can be formulated as follows. All phenomena, on every scale from the subatomic to the cosmic, are the result of the meeting and the interaction of three principles or forces. Scientists recognize the presence of two opposing forces in many phenomena, such as the existence of positive and negative electricity in physics, and of male and female cells in biology, but they do not see that the presence of these two forces constitutes a general law. They are still further from realizing that the existence of a third force is necessary for the occurrence of phenomena, for, according to G's teaching, nothing can happen without the intervention of a third principle or force. If two forces only come together, nothing occurs. Ouspensky told us that this idea that three forces are necessary for anything new to happen was to be found in many ancient teachings. It was the original source from which was derived the Christian doctrine of the coexistent and indivisible Trinity, and it appeared in another form in the Hindu teaching concerning the creation of the universe. From Brahman the Absolute arose Ishvara the Creator, and through the joint action of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, the three different aspects of Ishvara, there was produced everything that exists. A still clearer statement of the law of three was to be found in the Sankhya doctrine of the three gunas, Raja, Tamas, and Sattva. According to the Sankhya philosophy, different combinations of these three principles, each with its characteristic quality, accounted for everything existing in the phenomenal world. Ouspensky said that the three forces were called by G active, passive, and neutralizing respectively, but he added that these were only names to indicate a relationship existing between them at a given moment, for all of these forces could be active in certain circumstances. It was comparatively easy to see the existence of the first two forces, active and passive, but the third force was far less often open to observation. This was because at the level of consciousness on which we lived, we saw neither the universe nor ourselves as they really were, but only as they appeared to us to be in our state of waking sleep. And there's a footnote here. Aristotle also declared that all things are three, and that three is everywhere. For as the Pythagoreans say, the all and all things are determined by the number three. In other words, we were third force blind. By studying ourselves carefully, however, we should be able to find examples of the action in us of the three forces, and he gave us as one instance of this our desire to change. This desire could be regarded as active force in us, but it immediately came up against all the resistance of old habits and against our innate dislike of effort. which was second or passive force in us. Without a third force, these two opposing forces counterbalanced each other or revolved around each other so that nothing happened. Then, perhaps a third or neutralizing force appeared in the form of new knowledge in the learning of a special technique for bringing about a change, and with the help of this third force something might now begin to happen. Ouspensky rose from his chair, walked over to the blackboard, and drew on it a new diagram which he said represented no less an event than the creation of the universe. He called his diagram the ray of creation, and said that the work of creation started in the Absolute, and that the three forces within the Absolute possessed unique qualities. Unlike three forces elsewhere, they possessed will, full consciousness, and understanding, and this allowed them first to separate, and then to reunite at a predetermined point, and there to give rise to the first series of worlds in the ray of creation. This first series of worlds would be called all possible worlds. See figure 2. And I'm going to just briefly explain it. So we have 1, the absolute, then there's an interval, 3, all worlds, 6, all suns, 12, our sun, 24, all planets, another interval, 48, earth, 96, moon, and the absolute nothing. And they go from do, si, la, sol, fa, mi, re, do. And back to the text. In each of these newly created worlds there also existed three forces which repeated the process of interacting on each other, but because they only formed a part of the Absolute, and not the whole of it, they did not possess the will, consciousness, and understanding possessed by their predecessors. This being so, their meeting point was accidental and not predetermined. This meant that whilst the will of the Absolute created and controlled the first series of worlds, it did not govern the subsequent stages of the creative work, and the farther the ray of creation traveled away from the Absolute, the more accidental and mechanical did the creation and the control of the created worlds become. Ouspensky explained that the ray which he was drawing on the board was only one of a vast number of rays of creation, traveling outwards in all directions from the initial creative impulse in the Absolute. We were studying this ray because it happened to be the ray in which we were specially interested, our Earth being the sixth of the series of worlds marked on it. Enumerated outwards from the initial creative impulse, the series was as follows. First came the Absolute, and next all possible worlds. Under this term, all possible worlds, were included all the great stellar galaxies and the nebulae lying outside the Milky Way, as well as the Milky Way itself. The next world in the ray was made up of all suns in the Milky Way, followed in due course, first by the world of our sun, then by the world of the planets revolving around our sun, then by the world of the particular planet in which we live, namely the Earth, and finally by the world of the Moon. Ouspensky drew our attention to the fact that the ray of creation contradicted certain modern scientific ideas about the universe, first because it looked upon the universe as being a living thing, and second because it regarded it as a living thing which was still growing. Science, or at any rate the science prevalent at that moment, regarded the universe as something which had started very long ago and was now in the process of running down and coming to an end. According to this view, the moon was already dead, and the earth was also slowly losing its heat, so that in time it could come to resemble the moon. But the system we were studying took the opposite view and regarded the moon as in the course of becoming warmer and of preparing for the time when it would resemble the earth, and the earth would resemble the sun. Ouspensky also made a great point of the fact that the various worlds marked by the ray were not moving about independently of each other in a vast wilderness of empty space, but that everything in the universe was much more closely connected with everything else than we imagined it to be. Moreover, the intervals of space between the various worlds were very far from being empty. Energy was everywhere streaming down the ray and was being absorbed by the various worlds it met in its course. To be liberated again later on in some altered form. In other words, a great interchange of energies was taking place everywhere, the planets receiving energy from the sun, the earth from the planets, and the moon from the earth. Energy was passing also in an upward direction from the earth to the other planets, and thence onwards towards the sun and the Milky Way. The last way of looking at the universe was to picture it as a wilderness of space in which a comparatively few solid bodies were moving about. Space should be thought of instead of as a vast network of vibrations which radiated in every direction, a network in which a condensation of energy into matter was taking place at various points. But it was the radiations which were the primary entities of the universe, and the series of worlds into which they had condensed which were the secondary concretions. Having provided us with this immense scale example of the working of the law of three, Ouspensky passed on to a description of the second of the two great cosmic laws, the law of seven. He said that the immense network of vibrations constituting the universe could be used also to illustrate the action of the law of seven, a law which was often referred to as the law of octaves. Vibrations took place in all sorts of frequency and in all densities of matter, from the very finest matter down to the very coarsest. These vibrations could be visualized as traveling in all directions, crossing each other, colliding with each other, reinforcing each other, deflecting each other, and opposing each other. Western thought differed radically from the thought of the system on the subject of the manner in which these radiations developed. According to Western thought, they developed without any breaks or interruptions, continuing their course in a certain direction for as long as the original impulse which had given rise to them was sufficiently strong to overcome the resistance of the medium in which they were traveling. The principle of the continuity of vibrations was therefore firmly established in the West, but this was contrary to G's teaching, which proclaimed the contrary principle of the discontinuity of vibrations. According to this idea, no vibrations, whether they belonged to an ascending or a descending octave, developed uniformly, but always with accelerations or retardations at certain points. Another way of stating this cosmic principle would be to say that the force of an original impulse did not act uniformly throughout the whole process to which it had given rise, but slowed down at certain stages of it, so that the ascending vibrations began to ascend more slowly, and the descending octaves to descend more slowly at these points. After these temporary phases of retardation of the process of development, the vibrations resumed their former speed of acceleration or retardation, as the case might be, until they encountered the next check, when the same phenomenon of diminished acceleration or retardation happened again. As a first step to the work of locating the precise position at which these temporary retardations occurred, the lines of development of vibration should be divided into periods which corresponded to the doubling or to the halving of their frequency. Ouspensky gave as an example of this doubling or halving an increase in the rate of vibration of from 1,000 a second to 2,000 a second. When we examined the development of vibrations in this period more carefully, we found two places in which a retardation of the rate of acceleration occurred, one near the beginning of the process and the other almost at the end of it. According to G, the laws which govern the periodic retardations of the rate of increase or of diminution of the rate of vibrations were known to scientists in very ancient times, and they decided to record their discovery in the form of a seven-tone musical scale. The period of the doubling or of the halving of the rate of vibration now represents, therefore, the musical octave, and if we made use of the tonic solfa scale, we could say that the first check in an ascending octave occurred between the notes of mi and fa, and the second between si and the note of do of the succeeding octave. G called these two places in the octave where a slowing down occurred, and the rate either of acceleration or of retardation, the intervals of the octave. He said that they could be looked upon as being weak spots in the octave, where it was liable either to be arrested or else to be deflected in an entirely new direction. Both of these accidents were avoided if fresh energy was supplied at the intervals through the agency of another octave striking it there. Should the weakened octave be fortunate enough to receive this shock and this new supply of energy where where it required it, namely at the intervals, it would continue to develop and would maintain its original direction. Ouspensky then demonstrated the working of the law of seven on the diagram of the ray of creation. The ray of creation, he said, was a descending octave which started above with the sounding of the note do of the all or absolute, passed on to the si, all possible worlds, world 3, to la, all suns, or the Milky Way, world 6, to Sol, our sun, world 12, to Fa, all planets, world 24, to Mi, the earth, world 48, to Re, the moon, world 96, and finally to Do, the absolute again. The ray started therefore in the absolute and ended in the moon, and beyond the moon there was nothing, and this again was the absolute. The first interval in this great descending octave occurred between Do and Si, and this is to say, between the absolute and all worlds, in the second between Fa and Mi, in other words, between all planets and the earth. It was at these 2 points that the octave required help, and Ouspensky said that the first of these 2 intervals, between Do and Si, was filled by the Absolute, which possessed will and full consciousness. But the will of the Absolute did not reach so far as the second interval, so that something else must intervene there in order that the octave might continue. Unless a shock were supplied in this situation, no satisfactory passage of forces could take place. In order that this interval between the planets and the earth might be bridged, a special mechanical contrivance had been placed there, and this transmitting apparatus was organic life on the earth. The whole of life on the earth could be regarded as forming a kind of sensitive film which covered the crust of the earth, a film which first absorbed and then liberated energies coming from the higher region of the ray. Organic life, continued Ouspensky, may be looked upon as being both the earth's organ of perception and its organ of radiation. With the help of organic life, each portion of the earth's surface receives radiations coming from above. So also does organic life radiate certain energies in the direction of the moon. It is affected in turn by influences coming from the various orders of the worlds in the ray. For example, a small accidental tension in the planetary spheres can manifest itself in organic life in a prolonged disturbance of human behavior. Something which was entirely accidental and very transient takes place in planetary space, and it begins to work on the human masses so that people hate and begin to kill one another, and to justify what they are doing by means of some theory of brotherhood, equality of man, or justice. But, concluded Ouspensky, no matter what takes place in the thin film of organic life, it always serves the interests of the earth, the sun, the planets, and the moon. I was particularly interested in this extraordinary explanation of the function of life on earth, if for no other reason than that it was the first time I had ever come across an attempt to solve the problem of life on this planet. Some explanation of its presence on the earth was, in my opinion, needed, for I had never been able to accept the ordinary scientific view that the appearance of living things here was purely accidental. So many favorable circumstances had to be provided on the earth before they could survive here, that one was almost forced to believe in the existence of a great cosmic plan and in special preparations being made for the arrival of life. Moreover, there were other reasons for believing that life had a very special place in the great plan of world creation, and here was G strengthening these former prejudices of mine, first by confirming that there was such a thing as a plan, and second by saying that life on the earth served a very special purpose. Whether his explanation was a true one or not, it was impossible for me to say, but I could not do otherwise than admire the bold imaginative sweep of G's diagram of the ray of creation. At the next meeting, Ouspensky resumed his description of the universe and gave us an account of the special kind of stuff out of which everything was made. I had experienced that when he came to deal with this, as he would surely have to, he would develop some variety of idealistic philosophy, but no, instead of offering us this, he put forward a materialistic philosophy. According to G's teaching, everything in the universe was material, and potentially capable, therefore, of being weighed. But, Ouspensky continued, the concept materiality is as relative as is the concept man, and the materialities of the various worlds in the ray of creation are very different. Science regards matter as being everywhere much the same, varying only in such properties as density, and the idea of different orders of materiality is entirely foreign to it. Matter is translatable into energy, and, this being so, we can look upon the universe in three different ways: as a vast field of vibrations, as matter, or as matter in a state of vibration. If we regard the universe as matter in a state of vibration, the rate at which it vibrates is always in inverse ratio to its density. In other words, the denser the matter, the slower its rate of vibration. Ouspensky next explained to us that this term atom was used in G's system, and that an atom could be defined as the smallest particle into which matter could be divided without sacrificing any of its qualities. But it was important to bear in mind that G attributed to matter qualities denied to it by Western science, qualities of a psychic and cosmic as well as of a physical nature. We should also be clear about something which had already been mentioned, that matter was very different on different levels of the ray of creation, so different indeed that what was matter on a higher level of it would not be regarded as being matter at all on a lower level. For example, knowledge was actually material, but from the point of view of someone living on the earth, this idea seems strange and even ridiculous. Nevertheless, it should be noted that knowledge possessed one of the characteristics of matter, namely, that the quantity of it existing in a certain place at a certain moment of time was always limited. Ouspensky then redrew the ray of creation in an abbreviated form, which he called the 3 octaves of radiation, and he pointed out to us that the 7 worlds shown on it represented also 7 different varieties, or orders of materiality, ranging from the finest possible materiality of the absolute down to the densest of all matters in the moon. But he told us that although in the diagram these different orders of matter were shown unmixed, pure and existing on different levels of worlds, they were not actually isolated in this way from one another. Everywhere the matter belonging to one level penetrated the matter of another level. As water penetrates the interstices of a sponge, and in turn may be permeated with sugar, oxygen, or any other substance held in a state of solution. Because, therefore, materials of different cosmic orders were found intermingled in this way, there was no need for anyone to go to the sun in order to examine its materiality. Solar material could be far more readily examined as it existed in ourselves, for man, as has already been emphasized, was a miniature universe made of the same constituents and subject to the same laws as it. But, Ouspensky was careful to add, this idea that man is a microcosm in a macrocosm is true only of a man, that is in quotation marks, in the full sense of that word, that is to say, of a man in whom all latent powers have reached full development. Ouspensky said that the cosmic laws were the same everywhere and on all planets of the universe, but that when they manifested themselves in the different orders of worlds, they produced very different phenomena. Another thing that we had to remember was that we who lived on the earth and who were subject to its numerous laws were very far removed from the absolute. That was why he had said on a previous occasion that we were in a very unfavorable position for development. Life on the earth was very hard, and things which could be attained elsewhere comparatively easily could be attained here on the earth only as the result of very hard work. Ouspensky pointed out that the figures by which the various worlds in the ray of creation were designated, the figures 1 through 96, stood also for the number of forces, or orders of law, which govern the world in question. In the absolute there existed only one law and one force, namely the will of the absolute. In the world of the sun there were 12 forces, or orders of law, and in the world of the earth as many as 48. Only in the moon did there exist a still greater number of laws or forces. Someone asked what were the 48 laws which we on the earth had to obey, and Ouspensky corrected him and said that they should be regarded as categories of laws rather than single laws. There were, for example, a number of biological laws regulating the working of our bodies which had to be obeyed. But what was of most concern to us were the various psychological compulsions which determined our behavior. These inner compulsions were important because many of them were entirely unnecessary, and what we were now trying to do was to escape from some of them and to live under fewer laws. And it was not clear to some of his hearers As it was not clear to some of his hearers what was meant by escaping from unnecessary laws, Ouspensky gave us the example of a man who had been called up for national service. He said that previously such a man had to obey a number of laws of the realm as a civilian, but that now, as a soldier, he had to obey military regulations as well. If he did not do this, then he was liable to be put under arrest and confined in the guard-room, and there he would come under still more laws. His liberty would, therefore, be very restricted, and in order to free himself he would have first to conform to army regulations and then return to civilian life. If he were then to start work on himself and to struggle against his various identifications, he would gradually free himself from some of the more obvious compulsions of sleeping man, for these were included also in the earth's 48 categories of laws. And what an immense power these inner compulsions exerted over us. We were jerked through life on the wires of our likes and our dislikes, our blind urges and irrational compulsions, like so many marionettes. What a relief it would be to be free from some of these wires, so that we no longer drooped when something happened not to our liking, and revived again when things went well with us. How restful it would be not to have to be right, and to be under no obligation to convince other people that it was they, and not we, who made the mistake. It was quite unnecessary to seek for examples of living under unnecessary laws amongst youths called up for national service, for there were plenty of examples of this in our own lives. And, as I thought about the slavery imposed on one by all these inner compulsions, I realized for the first time the meaning of the words I had so often heard in church, whose service is perfect freedom. If a man managed to reach a higher level of being, and by doing so exchanged a lower for a higher order of laws, he would feel that in comparison with his former slavery, his servitude to these new laws was perfect freedom. At the next meeting, Ouspensky drew on the blackboard a simplified diagram of the ray of creation. He said that whilst the original diagram of the ray of creation had shown how the various worlds were created, this abbreviated one represented the changes which took place in the universe after it had been created. Actually, creation never stopped in the universe, but the growth of it was now taking place too slowly to be perceptible to such short-lived people as ourselves. The abridged edition of the ray of creation on the blackboard represented what Ouspensky called the 3 octaves of radiation in it, the first of these octaves being the octave between the Absolute and the Sun, the second between the Sun and the Earth, and the third between the Earth and the Moon. From this diagram, and with the help of the 2 cosmic laws, the law of 3 and the law of 7, Ouspensky now proceeded to derive a great number of matters with widely varying densities. The differences in their densities were so marked, indeed, that they ranged from 6 in the first series of created worlds to 12,288 at the opposite end of the ray, namely the Moon. The method by which the table of hydrogens, as it was called, was obtained from the 3 octaves of radiation is described in Ouspensky's book In Search of the Miraculous. To all of the matters derived in this way from the 3 octaves of radiation, Ouspensky gave the name hydrogen, explaining to us, as he recorded their densities, that the term hydrogen was used in the system to denote a substance when it was being considered without any reference to any force acting through it. If, however, the matter in question was serving as the conductor of the first of the 3 kinds of forces, namely acted force, then it took the name carbon, and, like the carbon of chemistry, it was designated by the letter C. When matter served as a conductor of the second or passive force, it was called oxygen, and designated by the letter O, and when it functioned as the conductor of the third or neutralizing force, it was given the name nitrogen, and known by the letters N. When I asked why the makers of this system of knowledge had purloined these terms from chemistry, and what relationship the carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen of the system bore to the same elements in science, Uspensky replied that after I had studied my second question more fully, I might be able to find out for myself the relationship existing between the hydrogen, carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen of the system and the same elements in ordinary chemistry. But he added, the use of these terms by the makers of the system was of great interest to us, for organic chemistry, from which they have been taken, was a comparatively new branch of science, little more than a century old. This suggested, he said, that the ancient system of knowledge we were studying could not have been given its present form much longer than about a century ago. The ideas themselves were, of course, far older than this, and all that he was speaking about was the method of presenting them to the Western mind. He added that another fact could be inferred from the use of these terms, namely, that the makers of the system in the present form must have been conversant both with ancient Eastern knowledge and with the modern Western science. When pressed to say more about the origin of the system, Uspensky replied that he could add little or nothing to what had already been said. G had never divulged the source of his knowledge, but had always been deliberately vague when speaking about it. All this he had All that he had ever said when questioned on this subject was that different esoteric schools in Asia specialized in different subjects. On being pressed to say how, if this were the case, he had managed to study such a large variety of subjects, he had replied, I was not alone. There were various kinds of specialists among those of us taking part in the search for truth, and each of us studied his own subject. Afterwards we foregathered and put together all that we had learnt. One of the members of the group asked Uspensky to give us examples of the working of the two great cosmic laws, in addition to those with which he had already provided us. To this he replied that we should come across many examples in the further course of our studies, but that in the meantime we could regard the action of a catalytic agent in chemistry as an excellent illustration of the working of the law of three. If hydrogen and oxygen were brought together in the correct proportions, they did not combine to form water unless either spongy platinum were present or an electric spark were passed through the mixture of gases. Here the platinum and the electricity acted in the capacity of the third force. But it was for us to find our own examples of the two laws, and he advised us to look for them in the world within us as well as in the world without. We should find an excellent example of the law of seven in what had happened when we took up some new activity, such as this work. We usually started off on a new project with great enthusiasm, sounding a note do which was sufficiently strong to allow our reaching the note fa or even the note mi. But at this point we often broke down or gave up, unless some new shock from an octave traveling in a similar direction arrived at the interval to rekindle our dying enthusiasm. We could also find many examples of octaves changing their direction at the intervals through the lack of any support there. If we studied various forms of human activity, think, he said, pausing and looking round the room, how many twists in the line of development must have taken place in Christianity to have produced out of a religion which started from the idea of universal love something so antithetical to this as the Inquisition and the burning of heretics. Yet the Church does not seem to have noticed any deviation of the direction in which it was traveling, and, whilst busy with its persecutions, was still proclaiming that it was teaching the gospel of Christ. Human history is full of broken and deviated octaves of this kind. Nothing ever stays for long on the same level, for ascent or descent is an event to which all activities are subject. The law of octaves not only explains much in our human actions, but it also helps us to understand the incompleteness of our knowledge in every field of study. We start off in one direction and then proceed in a new direction without ever having recognized what has happened. Uspensky concluded his talk on octaves by adding to his original exposition of the law of seven two new ideas. He told us that it was only ascending and descending octaves of a cosmic nature which managed to develop in an orderly way. maintaining their original direction, but that with us the orderly completion of an octave occurred only as the result of some fortunate accident. It happened that some other octave, traveling in a similar direction, impinged on the first octave, and by filling up its intervals made it impossible for it to complete itself. More often than not, our external activities came to an abrupt end, and if we were able to look back and see our lives as they had been lived, we should see in our past a trail of broken octaves, of feebly sounded does which had reached re and had then faded out, and of many octaves arrested at the first interval. The second idea Ouspensky added to those given at his first two talks on octaves was a particularly important one. It was the idea of vibrations within vibrations, or of inner octaves. Each note of an octave, he said, can be regarded as containing a whole octave on another plane. We have seen that finer materials in the universe permeate denser ones, and in turn are permeated by yet finer matters, and it is in these finer hydrogens that the inner octaves travel. For example, the substance of world 48 is saturated with the substance of world 24, and each note of the vibrations in the coarser substance gives rise to a whole octave of the vibrations traveling in this finer substance. It may be said, therefore, that each note of the earth contains a whole octave of the vibrations of the planetary world, each note of the planetary world a whole octave of the vibrations of the world of the sun, and so on. But there is a definite limit to the development of these inner octaves. As the range of hydrogens is limited, so also is limited the range of inner octaves. Ouspensky advised us to look for examples of inner octaves, more particularly in our inner work, and so far as I personally was concerned, I found them most often in the uncovering, from time to time, of new layers of understanding of work ideas. One first comprehended their obvious surface significance, and then, usually quite suddenly, a new and deeper layer of meaning was revealed in them, an experience which I attributed to the sudden perception of an inner octave. I had no opportunity of submitting these observations to Ouspensky, but they are at any rate in line with what he writes about inner octaves in his book In Search of the Miraculous. He refers there to G's statement that objective music is all based on inner octaves. Previously, G had spoken of art and had said that all ordinary art was subjective. By this he meant that the artist was completely in the power of the ideas and moods with which he was working, and it and not he created whatever resulted from his work. But in objective art, the results were calculated so that the artist was able to produce precisely what he wanted to produce. Objective art was mathematical, therefore, and not accidental. It gave rise to the results to which it was required to give rise, and the legend of the destruction of the walls of Jericho by music was a legend about objective music. So also were the Orphean legends concerned with objective art. On a much smaller scale, and in a more primitive form, objective music was seen at work in the art of the snake charmer. Ouspensky writes of this as follows: the snake charmer's music, is simply one note which is long drawn out, rising and falling only very little. But in this single note, inner octaves are going on all the time, and melodies of inner octaves which are inaudible to the ears but felt by emotional center. And the snake hears this music, or, more strictly speaking, he feels it and obeys it. The same music, only a little more complicated, and men should obey it. There had been previous talks about objective art, and they usually left the artists in our group unsettled and sometimes disgruntled. It was a difficult idea for them to accept that all the art which they had knew was subjective art, something that G had dismissed as not being art at all. To define objective art, G had said to his own group, is difficult, first because you ascribe to subjective art the characteristics of objective art, and second because if you happen to come across objective art, you do not see that it is on a different level from ordinary art. I measure the merit of art by its consciousness, you by its unconsciousness. A work of objective art is a book which transmits the artist's ideas not directly through words or signs or hieroglyphics, but through feelings which he evokes in the beholder consciously and with full knowledge of what he is doing and why he is doing it. Ouspensky was repeatedly asked by members of his group whether any works of objective art were still in existence, and he spoke of three things: the Sphinx in Egypt, of the legend of a statue of Zeus at Olympia, which produced in every spectator the same feelings, and the figure of a god or a devil which G and his fellow explorers had come across in a desert at the foot of the Hindu Kush Mountains. It was a figure which had a remarkable effect on them all, so that they seemed to grasp the meaning of its creator had wished to convey many centuries previously, and not only the meaning, but all the feelings and the emotions connected with it as well. Ouspensky also reminded us that literature had its objective works of art. He said that the Gospels had been distorted and added to in the process of being copied and translated, and that they had been written originally by men on a higher level than mechanical humanity, that is to say, by men who knew what they were doing and how to do it. There were many other examples of conscious or objective art in the sacred literature of the world. The philosophical side of G's system and his account of the universe cannot be submitted to a practical test in the way that knowledge of a psychological nature can. All that it was possible for me to do was to examine G's account of the ray of creation carefully, see whether it was consistent with other ideas we had been given, and then make up my mind whether it provided me with a reasonable account of the universe and its creation. There was this at any rate to be said in its favor, that, apart from the poetic descriptions of creation in the book of Genesis, it was the only reasonable account of it I had ever been offered.